Hello, everybody, and welcome to Supervisors Day. I'm your host, Cora. Thank you so very much for joining me. So, year three. Year three is a different year to year two. Well, that probably went without saying. But year two is, as we've already described, quite a challenging year. There's a lot of different kind of plates spinning in the air. There's a lot of different academic requirements at the university, and trainees are really just getting their feet under them when it comes to educational psychology practice on placement. And that's a challenging year as a consequence. And of course, they have their thesis, which they're just getting started with at the start of year two and building up throughout the year. And then obviously continuing through year three, but often they don't have data yet. Often they haven't quite completed their systematic review. They might have a final list of papers, but it's all wheels on the ground when we get to the beginning of year three, moving at full pace with the thesis, trying to get to being able to submit their thesis in June of their year three experience. Now, it is easier to focus on thesis in year three because they don't have any other academic requirements short of the work file. And of course, they have a bunch of placement requirements, which is, I guess, why we are here to kind of consider them. And they are going to be engaged in a bunch of different things as they begin to get increasingly familiar with engaging in educational psychology practice, though scaled back, obviously, to a level that a trainee would find manageable. But they are going to be engaging in a great deal of work, almost the full range of work that you might expect an educational psychologist to engage in, perhaps short of critical incidents. I'd be a little bit cautious about inviting a trainee to a critical incident without careful thought and without you being there as supervisor and without careful and structured supervision. And I'd be careful even then around critical incidents because they can be extremely demanding emotionally, as you well know. And of course, trainees will not have done one before. But sometimes there is a kind of, it can be a very powerful learning experience to be able to at least reflect upon your experience in a critical incident so that trainees can learn from those, so that when they get into qualified practice the year after this, after their year three experience, they can then at least know what is expected of them in a critical incident, should they be one of the EPs invited to go. I remember when I first started my critical incident work as an educational psychologist, and it is extremely challenging. It was extremely rewarding and important, and I'm glad that I did it. But I think some of the work from the university's own kind of small-scale research projects, shout out to our small-scale research projects, has been to identify that educational psychologists engaging in critical incident work often don't have a huge amount of experience to go on or a huge amount of training in critical incident work because, educational psychology trainees are not expected to engage in them, but fully trained educational psychologists are. So you might want to think about, how do you help trainees to be at least prepared for critical incidents, should they then be expected to engage in one when they are fully trained educational psychologists, even as perhaps the second or third person there. Might be good to have those conversations. But that's the kind of, critical incidents aside, educational psychology work, its full range, is kind of what trainees are going to be engaged in, from assessment and psychological formulation all the way through to low incidence casework, all the way through to, paths and multidisciplinary work, all the way through to systemic work and training. Trainees are going to be engaged in it all under your close guidance and supervision. And that's why year three is such an exciting year, because it means that trainees can really engage in a full range of EP work, and they aren't like year two trainees. A lot of these forms of work are not fully new to them. And so they can engage in more complicated work, more of the sort of the rote experience of educational psychology, getting the meetings into the diary, making sure that you have questions in mind you want to ask, just keeping the wheels on the train of any particular meeting. Those things become increasingly habitual, increasingly unconscious, increasingly automatic. And as trainees become automatic in those kind of rote elements of EP work, their conscious executive control can focus on the more complicated stuff, solving the problem that's in front of them, considering how to understand what's happening for this child or young person, pondering the wonders of making sure that a meeting doesn't just run smoothly, but that everybody comes together to try to help this child or young person to have a more included experience in school. And of course, they'll be engaging in statutory work. So to get us started then, let me make me bigger and it smaller. It serves my narcissism nicely. So there are obviously, like, these aren't two types of work, supervised work, casework and statutory casework. It'd be really weird if statutory casework wasn't also supervised. It absolutely is. But it's it's its own beast, not least because when it comes to modern EP practice, we're under no illusion that statutory casework has become such a mainstay of modern EP practice that it's important that we get the opportunity to talk about it a little bit specifically. That's why it's kind of separated out. But I mean, all of it, including statutory casework, will be supervised by your good selves. All work will be supervised by a supervisor at a rate of about half an hour per day of casework. So about an hour and a half a week, usually, given that trainees are on placement 3 days a week. They have 2 days where they're doing independent study. Sometimes they will be at uni on their Mondays. Sometimes they won't. Sort of depends on the Monday. Because they're in year 3 and because thesis has become so front and center, they have a lot of Mondays of self-study. I think they're in the uni for year 3 sort of specific teaching about 8 times in the year. Then they're in the uni for things like the postgraduate conference. They're at the uni for whole course days where you are very welcome to come as well as supervisors to come and learn about the wondrous things that we teach at whole course days. And not only that we teach, but that wonderful, amazing people. We've done a video on whole course days when we're talking about wonderful people come and talk about the wonders of educational psychology practice, or about the amazing sort of niche areas of psychology in which they are true experts. Awesome stuff. So apart from that, trainees are on placement. They're on placement 3 days a week anyway. And of course, they still add up to the 130 days throughout the year. Now, trainees can and often do ask you whether they could take a bit of a writing break by adding days to their Fridays and Mondays beforehand, or by promising to add days to their Fridays and Mondays afterwards. They might try to schedule a bit of a writing break. Often this happens around the winter holidays or around the kind of Easter holidays. It kind of depends on when they are at a place where they're ready to kind of take some time to really write their thesis. And the reason they do that is because there's obviously a bit of a break anyway. So adding a week on gives them a good 3 weeks either way to focus heavily on their thesis. You don't have to approve that, but we encourage you to at least consider it because it can be of extreme value to trainees. And what is easy to forget, of course, is that trainees won't qualify without completing their thesis. And if they don't qualify, then, you'll be employing trainee educational psychologists in year 4, right? So we want to make sure that trainees complete their thesis on time. We do everything in our power to make that happen internally. And if you can support us by helping them to take writing breaks, if they would find it helpful, we'd appreciate you a great, great deal. And of course, it would be helpful to your good selves because you're going to be employing them next year, quite possibly. So, having them fully qualified, fully complete, ready to start as a fully qualified EP in September, it's helpful to all of us, and indeed helpful to the trainee too. Now, of course, there is also statutory casework. Now, a year 3 should be working towards completing a piece of statutory casework, plus writing up the advice within 2 days by the end of the year. We definitely don't expect them to be there at the start of the year, but by the end of the year, hopefully. Now, I know that 2 days is tight. It's sort of just where educational psychology is at as a profession. So we're trying to get trainees into a position where they are ready to do the work of an educational psychologist as soon as they get started in September, because we know they're going to have some EHCPs to do as soon as they get there. So the aim is to start a little slower than that, possibly a bit slower than that, and then to build up to 2 days, or like 2 days for a statutory assessment by the time they reach the end of year 3. Now, of course, statutory casework, supervised casework isn't the only thing that they need to be thinking about. They also need to be thinking about casework vivas. Now, part of the requirements of the course, part of the requirements of the Department for Education, is that trainees are able to pass a casework viva, which is a fairly high-level assessment of their casework thinking, essentially. Can they answer questions, respond to scrutiny, defend their work against the scrutiny of experts in the field, often a principal educational psychologist and often an educational psychologist from the university, come together to ask complicated questions about casework that a trainee has given in reports about. So they will have written like reports, whether they be statutory casework reports, whether they be standard casework reports, whether they be consultation records, although that's a rarer thing given how limited information is in there. They submit the reports to the university, and then the university establishes a casework viva date, and then we ask questions about those reports at casework viva, and more broadly about the casework table. We ask questions about the actual reports themselves. We ask questions that scrutinize a trainee's thinking with regards to the casework that they have completed. Now, again, we're expecting trainees by the end of year 3, by the time we get to casework viva, to be familiar with the process of casework exploration and to be able to do the problem solving approach, whether it be through, we're expecting them to be able to deploy the Monson and Fredrickson problem analysis framework. We're expecting them to be able to, more importantly, think through the competing hypotheses that explain what's happening in this problem in an interactionist way, to be able to foster in their own minds an interactionist model of disability that considers both environmental and within-person factors as relevant to the genesis and solution of any problem. And we're expecting them to be able to apply relevant psychology to be able to understand and solve complex problems, not only in understanding the nature of the problem, but also in how they work with people to find a solution. And then they engage in the casework viva. It's also about ethics, right? Casework viva often will focus on questions of ethics, pondering the HCPC Code of Ethics and trying to invite trainees to understand and mull over, to circle in their minds and try and kind of consider all the ethical challenges or ethical controversies or areas of tension that might feature in any given piece of casework. They're always there, right? They're always there, whether it be about how to enable a child to affect proceedings that affect them, whether it be about ensuring that everybody is heard in the process, whether it be about ensuring that all relevant parties are properly and fully consulted to give us fully informed consent, whether it be about informed consent between, what is written and what is genuinely informed consent, rather than this kind of loosely informed consent that written consent can sometimes represent, or whether it be about innumerable other potential issues in a piece of casework that we're all so familiar with managing and considering, and that trainees need to ponder. So this is one of the things that can be helpful in supervision to focus on as you get towards the latter end of year 3, maybe all throughout, as you probably already do, right? You probably already consider the ethics of a casework in supervision, but it can be helpful as time goes on to kind of ponder explicitly, inviting trainees to bring to the surface any areas of ethical concern and invite them to more critically kind of review their own decision making in response to challenging ethical questions. That can be quite helpful because it does set them up for casework viva. Casework viva is challenging and it is tense, but it is supportive. Our hope is that we ask questions which are very challenging. We know that we need to ask questions that are challenging, those that need to be asked. But our very great hope is that we do so in the context of kindness, because we understand the challenges that trainees go through to be able to get here. In addition to the HCPC requirements, questions might cover the legal and ethical boundaries of educational psychology, bearing in mind the modern challenges of educational psychology, which we are all very aware of. How do we operate within the legal and ethical frameworks when, when service requirements can sometimes make that hard? For example, with reviews, how do we make sure that cases get reviewed so that we're sure that we are at least right in our assessment of what's going on, and that the solution that has been implemented is actually being implemented and is yielding change, right? How do we do that in the context of modern educational psychology practice, where all of our time is so tight and where reviews are rarely budgeted for? Non-discriminatory practice, not only our own non-discriminatory practice, how do we practice in a non-discriminatory way, but how do we encourage non-discriminatory practice in others? And how do we call out and challenge discriminatory practice where we see it? It's much, much harder, right? And it's easy to overlook the importance of that. So that's a classic question that sometimes does get asked in Casework Viva. Sounds like you encountered some discriminatory practice. What did you do in response to it? What do you think needs to be done in those circumstances to ensure that children and young people are treated in a non-discriminatory way? Informed consent, of course. We need to consider not only, because we talked about this briefly already, informed consent in inverted commas can often be a thing that is signed. And then we think, we have informed consent. But of course, the signage is often a fait accompli. It's often to be able to access the support that a parent or a young person themselves feel that they need. But it's not often truly informed, right? And informed consent isn't a thing that is done at one point. It's something that continues to be fostered throughout a piece of involvement, where each individual component of that involvement, we ensure that everybody is happy with us doing before we do it, understanding the potential ramifications and consequences. Professional duty of care. How have we ensured that we have fulfilled our duty of care when it comes to the children and young people in our care? Effective self-management and resources. For sure, critical to ensure that all educational psychology trainees are at all times in a position to be able to fully exercise their duties, not least their duty of care. And if they are not engaging in effective self-management, then it gets very difficult to exercise those duties consistently and fully. And so trainees need to be able to understand how to recognize when they are not exercising effective self-management, and how to seek support and exercise this effective self-management. And in the most challenging cases where they feel they are not fully able to exercise their duties, how to recuse themselves from the work that they're engaged in, and how to ensure that work is completed adequately by somebody else if they are unable to do so themselves. Working in partnership with other professional support staff, service users and their families, incredibly challenging in modern EP practice. In local authorities right now, with budgets so tight, multidisciplinary working is the first thing that goes, even though I think we all consider it to be quite an effective and time-efficient method of working. But it is a requirement in the ethics to ensure that we work appropriately with other disciplines. So how do we do that in the context of modern challenges and modern constraints? The evidence base for the interventions. How do we ensure that we work in an evidence-based manner? We know from the academic critiques in year 2, at least. We also know from the wider literature that there is very little evidence for a lot of the interventions that get recommended in school, certainly a lot of the interventions that schools deploy. So how do we ensure that we engage in solutions propose solutions, make sure they are implemented in a way that is supported by the theoretical evidence base, even if it can't be supported by the direct evidence base, i.e., this specific intervention has quite a weak evidence base. But how do we ensure that even in that context, we can still implement solutions which are supported by the wider theoretical literature, i.e., they're consistent with the theory, even if this particular self-determination theory intervention hasn't been shown to be super effective, hasn't been shown to be ineffective, just hasn't been the study of wider research. But how do we, if we were to implement something that it fostered agency, that fostered interpersonal communication and collaboration, that fostered a feeling of competency, maybe that is still consistent with self-determination theory, and we know that from the wider literature that those things are critical in children's learning and motivation. So it's still consistent with the wider literature, even if that specific intervention hasn't been the focus of a lot of research. How do we make sure that we engage in our role as psychologists, only in our role as psychologists, rather than stepping into areas of expertise we aren't sort of fully an expert in? And how do we manage the barriers therein? It's really challenging, particularly where, you know, a lot of the work is answering questions from parents. When I don't know is the answer, I don't know is the answer. It can be very tempting to say something that is outside of our area of expertise. But if I don't know is the answer, I don't know is the answer. How do we ensure that we monitor the impact of our work in the context of either reviewing, or at least in the context of ensuring that a school reviews in our absence where it is impossible? The partnership with service users, making sure that young people and children are empowered to have their voice heard and are empowered to affect the proceedings that affect them. And how can we practice ethically within imperfect systems? Of course, none of us are surprised to learn that the systems are imperfect. They always were, but in the last 14 years or so, they've become more imperfect. Certainly, budgets have become more stretched, and EP's time has become incredibly challenging to use effectively, because we find it harder to be involved at an earlier stage proactively or preventatively. We are fighting fires which have been blazing for some time, and we are trying our best to make sure that children can be included when they've been excluded for much longer than they once would have been. So it is harder for educational psychologists to practice effectively in modern systems, but it's also harder for us to practice ethically when these contexts, these challenges, the problems, the issues of inclusion, because they're so much more entrenched, because they've been around for so much longer, because children and people have been excluded for so much longer, it can be much harder, take longer time to make sure that we solve the problems of their inclusion. And in a service, in a system that restricts EP time so heavily, it can be hard to practice ethically and effectively. So how do we do that? Well, thankfully, we have you, and we know that need is the catalyst for invention. And so here, we know that educational psychologists are in need, and we know that the young people with whom they work are in need. But in supervision, it's one of the wonders of having a trainee with you. We can engage in complex problem solving about the system itself and see how do we ensure that we practice ethically and effectively, even where there is a great deal of need that is unmet. Finally, I want to introduce you may well have already been introduced to the Southampton Educational Psychology, the University of Southampton Educational Psychology Research blog. Bing! Just going to make it a bit bigger for you there. Absolutely. All the work that educational psychology trainees at the university conduct that is marked at a distinction level, and all their thesis work, all finds its way onto the Educational Psychology Research blog. It's cool. Check it out, please. It is incredibly well put together and maintained by Colin. We appreciate him a great deal. And it's just a really good place to find out stuff. If, for example, you are running an intervention or a trainee is thinking about running an intervention and is unsure of the evidence base, it's always worth a look on the research blog, because you never know that a good, high quality academic critique might well have been done on that intervention. And if it has, go check it out. I mean, it's a really cool resource. Please do take a look. So that's year 3. Year 3, begins around September, ends in July. The casework viva is sometime, I think, in June. Thesis viva in July. So, it's a difficult year for our trainees. But most of all, we are grateful, because while our year 3s find year 3 difficult, they are universally kind of warm, I think. We hear such wonderful things about the supervision they receive from you. And it's your time and your patience and your kindness that makes year 3 what it is. So thank you for all of it. And thank you for joining me and for reviewing year 3 together. Good luck. And I look forward to seeing you, as always, in the next one.